Long have the religious made the claim that morality is nothing but obedience to the edicts of their respective gods. That obedience to the gods is holy, because that whichever the gods have commanded is holy. Rather than being the solid foundation that it is often hailed as, however, any moral system built upon such grounds rests upon nothing but sand. No reason is ever given for why morality is obedience to the whims of the all-powerful. Such a stance is ultimately nothing more than the claim that might makes right. This being said, it certainly is understandable why there is motivation to cling to the moralities of old, especially when one faces the horror of a life, not merely without meaning, but without the possibility of meaning. In truth, if there are no reasons in life to choose one course of action over another, then there can be no answer to be found to the fundamental question of how then are we to live. This, the fundamental question of how to live, is the burning question of every living being that possesses the faculty of rationality. This question remains, even when we ignore it and distract ourselves from it. One may, of course, object to this. One might argue that it is simply true that there are no true moral values, that moral propositions cannot carry any truth values whatsoever, and that as such, there are no right or wrong ways of living. This is what is known as moral nihilism, the rejection of the idea of moral truth. A variant of this point of view, called emotivism, is advocated for by atheist philosopher YouTuber Alex O'Connor. In his view, moral statements are nothing more than expressions of emotion.
That when people make ethical statements, they're just expressing emotions at each other. And it's a view that's called ethical emotivism. And there are sort of two approaches to talking about it. One of them is the slightly more academic, definitional, what does the word good mean, what's going on in people's brains when they talk about it. And that's an interesting conversation, but on I suppose a more personal or colloquial level, it means that when someone says that something is good or bad, when someone morally approves or condemns something, they are essentially just expressing an emotion. The reason that's a pessimistic view is because it makes it very difficult to tell people that they're wrong in any objective sense. If you do something I don't like, and I go boo at you, I mean, that might mean something, but there's no real normative force to that. There's nothing I can do to say that my boo is correct in a way that yours isn't.
But I'm broadly attracted to this view that when we make ethical statements or pronouncements, we're essentially just expressing emotions at each other. And so when I say that murder is wrong, I'm sort of expressing some kind of distaste, or I'm expressing something akin to saying, don't do that, which is just like a command. It doesn't have any truth value. It's not even subjectively true or false. It's just like a command or an expression.
My aim in this video is to refute this stance. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to confront Alex on his views during the Q&A section after a debate that he participated in with Craig Biddle. This is what I asked. Good evening.
Hi.
So my question is for Alex. Alex, is it not the case that by engaging in this debate, you performatively presume the value of rationality, that people ought to be rational, that the very act of engaging in a rational dialogue advocating for emotivism is to present what you believe to be reasons for why people ought to embrace emotivism? If we reject the notion that there can be any truth value to moral claims, does this not reduce your very case for emotivism to be nothing but yay emotivism?
Yes, I would say it probably does, but that's just what I think ethics is. And so to the extent that there are value judgments at the foundation of epistemology, as an emotivist, I would have to say that those are emotivist expressions. They're emotive expressions. And so the extent to which I say, me coming here incurs or requires some kind of value, well, sure, I value a great deal of things. I value having interesting conversations. I value answering questions from people in an audience. I think it's fun. I think it's enjoyable. I think it's edifying. Can I say that I should do those things, therefore? Yes, as long as I translate that should in an emotivist framework, which just means like, yay. It's an emotive feeling. I mean, it doesn't mean yay, but it means something analogous to yay. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say you should be an emotivist in the sense that there's some kind of objective moral standard by which you're not, to which you're not according if you're not an emotivist. I would just say that, like, to the extent to which you're able to sort of engage with what I'm saying and understanding the arguments I make, you then hearing that and going, I'm not an emotivist, just makes me sort of go, boo, man.
If odd is a mere expression of emotion, then does that not undermine any binding force that your arguments could have?
Oh, yeah, no, it does. Oh, no, my arguments...
Could you repeat the question? I didn't hear that.
If odd is a mere expression of emotion, then does that not undermine any binding force that your arguments could have?
Any binding force that my argument can have? Ethically, yes, but rationally, no.
So that presumes the value of rationality.
There are two ways that something combined. Rationality combined, I think, amorally, and that's a controversial position. I don't mean controversial as in it's unpopular. I mean that people debate it. I think that rationality can just lead you into the arms of a conclusion. If I show you that there are 2 glasses here and 2 bottles here, rationality dictates that there are 4 drinks receptacles on the table. Is that a moral statement? I just don't think so. I really don't. And so the point that I make, I mean, if I make a point like that, if I say, look, there are 2 here and there are 2 here, if somebody uses the language, therefore you should believe there are 4, I think they're slightly misusing the word should. Maybe, they might mean something like rationality, your rational faculties are going wrong, again, not in a moral sense, but in the way that like a chair that doesn't hold things up is a bad chair. Use the word bad, but you wouldn't say it's an immoral chair. You know what I mean? I feel like it's something like that going on with rational statements. But to the extent to which I make any kind of ethical claim, and maybe you think that is an ethical claim, in which case, yes, it would undermine any binding force outside of, given that I think that, like Craig said a moment ago, I don't go around saying, why aren't you a rational egoist? I sort of go around saying that you are an emotivist. I think that is what people are doing. And so I think, well, not an emotivist, because that requires believing you're doing that, but I think you are just emoting. And so if I were to sort of raise the same kind of moral feeling within you, or say, let's say that sort of it failed to raise within you, then the extent to which I'm using the language of like, oh, you should do this, or you should think this moral statement, I'm sort of booing the fact that you don't also feel boo, if you see what I'm saying. It's quite hard to get the language right here, but I hope that makes sense.
I maintain my disagreement. In fact, I find myself compelled, bound by reason to disagree. As such, I aim to present reasons for rejecting emotivism as false, which is to say that I will be advocating for the point of view that the meta-ethical theory of emotivism is false. If my reasoning is sound, then my argument will show why one should reject emotivism as false. If my last few sentences sound redundant and obtuse, then I have successfully laid the first brick of the edifice that is my argument. I take these last 3 statements to be equivalent in meaning. See, it seems to me that the very act of advocating for a particular stance necessarily entails the notion that there are reasons for embracing one particular point of view over another. Anyone who objects to this would of course present what they believe to be a myriad of reasons for rejecting the notion that there are reasons for accepting or rejecting stances. But in doing so, they are assuming in fact that there are reasons for rejecting a stance, thereby invalidating their own stance. As if the stance that there are no reasons for accepting or rejecting a stance relies upon the notion that there are reasons for rejecting a stance, then it is clear that the stance that there can be no reasons for rejecting a stance is in fact self-refuting. What does any of this have to do with morality? See, I take morality to be concerned with the notion that there are reasons to act, or to refrain from action. It seems to me that the idea of ought itself simply refers to the idea that there are reasons for pursuing certain courses of action over others. That certain reasons can be more correct than others. When someone argues for a particular point of view, they present reasons for why that point of view is correct, reasons for why it is true. But what is the significance of truth? Why does it matter at all if something is true? Why communicate it to others? What makes the truth of a claim a reason for believing it? When Alex admits that ultimately his arguments boil down to nothing but an emotive expression, he undermines his own stance. After all, why does it matter whether something is a certain way or not? When Alex asserts that ethics is nothing but us emoting at each other, is he not advocating for the point of view that ethics is nothing but emoting? Yes, he can insist that he is not saying that we should be emotivists in an objectively moral sense, but if we were to adopt the stance that there are no reasons for accepting true things as true, then all discussion and debate is rendered moot. It simply does not matter that a certain claim may be more or less true than another, if the truth of a claim does not constitute a reason for its acceptance. It does not matter that a particular argument may or may not be valid, if we have rejected the very notion that there is a such thing as validity. If we, however, embrace the old-fashioned notion that the rules of logic apply, and that there is, in fact, reason to believe in true things, that truth matters, then we have implicitly accepted the notion that there are reasons to act, or to refrain from action, at least insofar as such action extends to the acceptance or rejection of certain points of view. That one ought to embrace a point of view if it is true, and that one ought not to embrace it if it is demonstrably false. Understood this way, the emotivist can be understood to be arguing for why one ought to reject the notion that ought statements are anything but expressions of emotion, carrying with them no truth values whatsoever. This, however, is a statement of ought, and if true, would either reduce the emotivist stance to nothing but itself an expression of emotion, incapable of bearing any truth value at all, or it would constitute a self-refuting statement, if we hold that logical consistency matters at all. One might retort that no, the emotivist is not saying that one ought to hold moral statements to be nothing but expressions of emotion. Rather, the emotivist is simply stating that it is true that moral statements are nothing but expressions of emotion. That the claim that moral statements are nothing but emotional expressions is a purely descriptive claim, without any prescriptive element whatsoever. I contend, however, that even if we were to grant that the statement is itself purely descriptive, that the act of describing the thing to another is a prescriptive one, that to describe a particular point of view as correct is to recommend that point of view to others. It is to present to others reasons for perceiving the matter a certain way, which is to say that it is an attempt to show why one ought to adopt a certain point of view. If this is not the case, then why advocate for the stance to begin with? Is it not the case that arguing on behalf of a point of view constitutes advocacy for it? One might contend otherwise, that arguing for a stance does not, in fact, consist of advocacy for the same. One could play the devil's advocate, for example, and argue for a stance that one does not believe in. Take note, however, that my argument does not pertain to the intentions of the arguer. It is not a claim that anyone who argues for anything believes in what is argued. Rather, my argument entails a claim about argumentation itself, that the act of arguing for a stance necessarily involves the act of presenting reasons why one should adopt a stance. The devil's advocate is indeed doing just that when they argue for a stance. They are presenting reasons in support of adopting a stance that they simply may not, in fact, believe in. Now, they themselves may not believe that these reasons are necessarily valid, or they may recognize the existence of other, more compelling reasons for why they ought to adopt a different stance. Playing the devil's advocate entails the willingness to consider ideas without necessarily accepting them, and as such, it involves the consideration of reasons for why one might have cause to embrace a particular argument. And the notion that one has cause to do any particular thing at all rests upon the idea that there are reasons for choosing one course of action over another. And insofar as there is reason for choosing one course of action over another, that is the extent to which there is reason for why one should choose one over the other. I shall now restate my argument. To argue for the position that there is no reason to either pursue or to reject courses of action is to present reasons for adopting the stance that there is no reason to either pursue or to reject courses of action. The notion that there are reasons for pursuing or rejecting courses of action is the notion that there are reasons why someone ought or ought not act in a particular fashion. As such, to argue for the position that there is no reason to either pursue or reject courses of action is to argue for the position that one ought not think that we ought to do or not do anything at all. This is a contradiction. Not only this, however, it would seem that any attempt to deny the notion that there are right and wrong answers about human action, about morality, would, by its very nature, run headfirst into this contradiction. That to deny the existence of moral truths itself is to claim, as if it ought to be believed, that there are no moral truths. In essence, that it is morally true that one should not recognize moral truths. This is a contradiction. I find this to be underscored by something that Alex says in a video of his from several years ago.
Now, interestingly, I'd love for Harris to be right. I really would, because of the benefits of objective morality that I just outlined. But if I want to be really philosophically satisfied, I have to be intellectually honest. And when it comes to Harris's morality, I just don't buy it.
Did you catch that? Alex is saying that he cannot embrace Sam Harris's view that morality is objective because he has to be intellectually honest. Alex here is citing intellectual honesty as his motivation for rejecting a stance, as if it could be a reason for rejecting a stance. Intellectual honesty is a moral virtue. To extol the value of intellectual honesty is to claim, as if it were true, that we ought to exhibit intellectual honesty. As such, to claim that intellectual honesty leads you to reject the notion of moral truths is to claim that moral virtue leads you to reject the notion that there are moral virtues. This is again a contradiction. Intellectual honesty requires the notion that there is reason to act a certain way, that this way is what we call honest, and that it is to be preferred over the alternative. He presents a similar sentiment in his video response to rationality rules. He makes it clear at the outset that if Stephen, the guy who runs the YouTube channel, could produce a valid argument in which there is an ought in the conclusion, which doesn't derive from an is, then he would change his mind and believe morality to be objective.
Now, let me be clear. If Stephen can produce a sound deductive argument with an ought in the conclusion that doesn't derive from an is, I will change my mind and believe morality to be objective immediately. He wins the argument, because the conclusion would have to be true.
Why, Alex? Why would you change your mind if it could be shown that it is true, that morality is objective? What reason would there be to do this? One might say, well, duh, it would be because it was shown to be true. Intellectually honest people are willing to admit when they're wrong. But arriving at that conclusion would be to do the very thing that you are claiming in this video is erroneous. You are acting as if the truth of the matter is a reason for acting. In this case, the action involved being changing one's mind. That is, you are deriving the ought from the is. If we were to operate off of emotivism, we would be forced to conclude that it is merely your preference to believe in true things, that something being true itself cannot be a reason for believing in it, that therefore every argument that you have ever presented, that you could ever present, is nothing more than an expression of a completely subjective emotion. That ultimately, there is not merely no moral objectivity, but rather that there is no objectivity to be found at all. It would seem quite evident, however, that when one is presenting arguments on behalf of a particular point of view, they are, in fact, giving reasons for its adoption. That they are saying that these truths are the reasons why one should adopt that point of view. That the truth itself is a reason for action, and that the reasons for action, the oughts, therefore come from the is, the truth. Yes, I know, David Hume thought differently, but it would seem that he was and is wrong, and that therefore his guillotine ought to be discarded. To argue that there is this barrier between is and ought is to advocate for the stance that people ought not derive oughts from what is. In another video, Alex says that there is nothing wrong with constructing a moral framework upon subjectivity, as long as it is recognized as such.
Now, don't get me wrong here. I am, like I say, a moral subjectivist myself, and so, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with constructing a moral framework based in subjectivity, as I'm claiming the religious do, as long as the framework is recognized as such. All I'm saying is that whilst religious morality claims to be objective, it is in fact ultimately subjective, and so needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper or grounded ethics.
Is it not the case, Alex, that your assertion that religious morality needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper or grounded ethics is nothing but a prescription to the religious? Are you not saying that religious people should stop presuming that the religious theories, such as the divine command theory, are valid theories, that they should stop acting as if they truly ground objective morality? If so, I agree with you here, but in the very act of making this claim, I think that you are acting in contradiction to your entire metaethical theory. That there is no reason why anyone should, or in this case, equivalently, needs, to do anything at all. This renders your claim that the religious need to stop claiming that their morality is objective utterly toothless, as well as any other recommendation that you could ever make. Is it simply rational to reject the idea of moral truths? What are you really saying when you insist to others that a point of view is rational? By doing so, one implicitly places a premium upon rationality, recommending it to others. But to recommend a behavior by presenting reasons for engaging in it is to act as if one should be rational. The idea that someone should be rational is a moral truth claim. To deny the existence of moral truths on the ground of a moral truth is to err. As such, my principal objection to the emotivist stance is that it is contradictory. That it relies upon concepts such as logical validity, that it implicitly denies by rejecting the possibility that there is a such thing as right action. That it is right that there is no such thing as right and wrong. One might insist, as Alex does, that they mean right in a non-moral sense, that a claim can be binding amorally, but it is truly doubtful that there is such a thing, as a sense of rectitude absent of any notion that there is a reason to be right is a sense that is nothing but trivial. If we adopt emotivism, then all moral sentiments, including such sentiments as the notion that people should be intellectually honest, logically consistent, and that it behooves them to ensure that their reasoning is sound, are all made out to be truly nothing more than a mere matter of taste. Ask yourself this. Is it truly not better that slavery be abolished, that tyrants be dethroned, that those who wrong the innocent be punished, that the innocent not be wronged at all? Are the cries of those suffering underneath the yoke of their oppressors truly in vain? Do they in fact possess no greater claim to their freedom than their enslavers possess to their continued domination? Is it merely a matter of taste? That the slave simply dislikes being a slave, and the master simply enjoys being a master, and that is the end of the story? What could be greater madness than to proclaim as if it were true that there is no reason at all to prefer virtue over vice, freedom over slavery, a meaningful and fulfilling life over one that is nothing but an exercise in frivolousness? Does this not mean that there is no reason to live, that a fulfilling, meaningful, and happy life is nothing short of a delusion? One might attempt to reconcile this by simply suggesting that the denial of moral values does not, in fact, necessitate such despair, that it frees us to simply do whatever it is that we want. All of the world's pleasures are available to us. There is nothing stopping us from reaching out to take, and take, and take, and take. The absolute horror of this immediately unfolds before our very eyes. If there are truly no courses of action to be preferred over any other, then there is no reason at all for why the wails of despair of a violated woman should warrant any greater sympathy from us than the lustful desires of her rapist. It would seem so intuitively obvious to most that one should prefer the wish of the victim to not be violated over the wish of the aggressor to violate. Yet, if we annihilate the concept of should, we thereby annihilate the very notion that there is reason to choose one over the other. If they are logically consistent, the emotivist is compelled to soullessly admit that no, there is truly no reason to choose one over the other. There is not any more reason to come to the rescue of the victim than there is to join in with her tormentor. Of course, they will caveat that they personally do not like the latter course of action, that they themselves much prefer the former. Undeterred by the fact that this utterly trivializes ethics, they insist that this is the proper way to understand moral truth claims, that they are, in fact, nothing but expressions of personal preference. One might accuse me here of begging the question, making an appeal to consequences without first demonstrating those consequences to be, in fact, bad. Take note, however, I am not saying that those consequences are the reason why emotivism is false. Again, I contend that the reason why emotivism is false is due to its own self-refuting nature. Ask yourself this, however. Why should someone not beg the question, or make an appeal to consequences? Why ought one not engage in all sorts of fallacy, all the while claiming that they are engaging with the utmost of rigor? To counter by way of pointing to fallacy is to act as if there is something significant or important about refraining from such. It is to act as if there is some sort of reason to adhere to logical rigor. And what is the point of logical rigor if not the discovery of the truth? Why engage in it if there is no reason to believe in true things? What is logic, other than the identification of coherent and consistent reasons for the truth or the falsehood of claims? I contend that something being true is itself the reason for believing in it, that the truth of the matter is itself why one ought to recognize it as such. Do you now ask, why ought we believe in true things? Is the answer, because they are true, invalid? Again, what is validity? Certainly you do not mean logical validity, as if you do, then you are necessarily operating off the presumption of the efficaciousness of logic. Efficacy for what, I ask? For discerning the truth. Armed with this understanding, we can thereby conclude that if the answer is invalid, its invalidity stems from that of the question. That the question itself is the culprit. That it is as absurd and useless a philosophical question as the question, how do you know that you truly exist? I know that I exist because it is obvious. I know that I should believe in true things because it is obvious. I take it to be axiomatic that the truth itself constitutes the reasons for embracing it, that any challenge to this principle will be ultimately self-refuting. I contend that any advocacy for the negation of this point of view would necessarily constitute the attempt to present reasons for rejecting it, that it would claim that those reasons are true, and that therefore the truth of those reasons is the reason to reject the point of view, that the truth of the matter can constitute a reason to act at all. That ultimately, Any such attempt would implicitly presume to be true that which it is attempting to deny. Therefore, it would seem that this idea, that something being true is itself the reason for believing in it, is simply evident. This does not, in any fashion, alleviate one of the responsibility to establish truth. This is not to say that it is correct to simply declare something false as true. Rather, what I am saying is that something being true is indeed reason enough for recognizing it as such. Do you think that I take too much for granted here? That the acceptance of such axioms resembles faith a little too much? I contend that my stance, if it is indeed faith, is the best kind of faith one can have. It is a faith in the possibility of knowledge, in the efficaciousness of reason. It is a faith that celebrates the capacity of the human mind to discern truth. Is it, however, truly faith to maintain a conviction in the possibility of knowledge and the rational faculty necessary for its acquisition? I challenge you to turn your skepticism upon skepticism itself.
Let's not forget the basic premise of skepticism, which is to take nothing for granted.
Should we take for granted that we are to take nothing for granted? It would seem that it is impossible to operate without first principles, that one must accept a starting point somewhere. Is this an argument for adopting any starting point whatsoever, believing blindly in some arbitrary thing just for the hell of it? Of course not. I contend, however, that it is fully justifiable to embrace truths that are, in fact, self-evidently true. And while it is not self-evidently true that there is a God, it is self-evidently true that we live, we exist, and that the function and purpose of our minds is to understand the world, for discerning the truth. That the means by which such understanding can be gained is through reason.
Like, how are we now going to live? That's what people are interested in, man. Like, people say, like, they want to know what's true, and sure, yeah, people do. It's interesting, but what people really want and need generally is to know how to live. And if philosophy is supposed to be for any purpose, it has to be something like that. I mean, are you just doing philosophy to know true things? That's fine if you are, but I think that the more interesting and useful kind of philosophy is the philosophy that tells you how to live.
How are you to have any chance whatsoever in answering this question if you give up on the possibility that the question is answerable? That is, in fact, what emotivism does. Emotivism, by rejecting the possibility that moral claims can have any truth value whatsoever, ultimately rejects the notion that there are reasons to act, that there is a such thing as a better or worse reason. At a fundamental level, emotivism is useless. There is no fashion in which it possibly improves the human experience, as it rejects the very idea that anything could be an improvement over anything else. To the emotivist, there can be no such thing as moral progress. There are simply differing attitudes around the globe and across generations. If you reject the possibility of moral truths, then you have thrown your hands into the air and simply given up on the moral discussion. Doing so ultimately precludes you from any claim to logical consistency, however, when you make recommendations for the behavior of others. And telling us that we should gain a sense of urgency from our mortality is to do just that.
We are in an emergency. This is an emergency, man. Like this is great. I was invited in a couple of days. I'm going to do this debate about fearing death, and the motion was something like, resolved. We should not fear death. And they invited me along and said, "Oh, we'd love to come and have you debate this." And I said, "I'll do it, but I have to do the we should fear death side. That's the side I'm going to be on, because I think that a healthy fear of death is crucial."
Given the emergency that we face, should we just give up on figuring out how to live? Or could it be the case that, as you say, our mortality does, in fact, give us reason to act? That figuring out how to live is in fact the most urgent question for us, as we have limited time to do so. That we must do what we can to discover how best to live with ourselves and with one another. With regards to how we are to deal with one another, we only have two fundamental options. We can either deal with one another by reason or by force. If we choose to deal with one another rationally, then we must recognize the efficaciousness of reason. That by way of reason, the truth can indeed be known, and it is by reason that we are able to communicate those truths to others. If, however, we conclude that it is impossible to intelligibly communicate truths due to the supposed fact that that which is can give us no reason to act, then we are left with no other recourse but force and coercion. We talk to each other because we're able to negotiate what we want with others. But if we reject the notion that there is any reason at all to prefer any course of action over any other, if everything is truly nothing more than a matter of personal preference, then all argument is moot, and that there is, indeed, no hope of goodwill amongst men. When conversation becomes impossible, what recourse is left us, other than an appeal to the sword? An idea, if true, cannot be self-defeating. A true system cannot undermine the means by which one can establish its truth. Reason is our means for establishing truth and falsehood. True morality must be grounded in reason, rather than exist in opposition to it. Just as reasoning with one another presumes efficaciousness of reason, the very act of communicating ideas involves making use of one's freedom to do so. Just as it is self-defeating to advocate for the notion that arguments can carry no weight, so too does it defeat the entire point of conversation to advocate for retribution on the mere grounds of advocacy, as it legitimizes one's own advocacy as grounds for punishment. As such, any moral system that advocates against the freedom to reason cannot be a true or correct moral system. If a moral system is to even have a shot at being true, it must first and foremost uphold the freedom of the mind to reason in the pursuit of truth, which is to say that true morality recognizes the sovereignty of the individual over their own mind, which is to say, over their own self. You do not truly possess a mind. You are your mind. You do not merely possess a life. You are your life. To think freely, to live freely, to be free is your birthright. Why settle for anything less?